My wife thinks that I should do all my videos in front of her garden like this, and from where I'm sitting, I'm not sure that I disagree because it just smells wonderful. Um, we've got some flowers over here, but what I'm getting is just fresh tomato, and it's pretty nice. I'm having a nice time right now. My coffee's very good this morning as well. Um, we're talking about Jesus calming the storm as Mark tells the story this morning. And as a sailor, I can't help but sort of riff on that to begin with. It's not a story so much as just something that I've observed many times, and that is when you take new people out, sailboats just tip, and watching the reaction is really interesting. Um, you know, you've got 25, 30, maybe more feet of mast sticking up over the water. The boat's only so wide. The water is not a stable surface, and you've got wind pressing into it. And wind is powerful. We underestimate how powerful wind is. And so sailboats, the smaller sailboats can tip over, and you've got to hang out the side to keep them flat. But most of the sailboats that you see out on the bay or wherever have a ballast keel. In my case, it's 600 pounds of cast iron hanging down 3 feet, and it's bolted onto the bottom of the boat. And that keeps you upright. The wind blows, and you sort of get the angle to the wind right, and the boat will find an equilibrium between basically its sort of forward momentum and the wind pressure. They kind of end up balancing out, and so it kind of tips, and then just stays there. And it's actually really stable. I would much rather be out on a sailboat on a windy day with lots of pressure in the sail than in a motorboat on a calm day, because the motorboat will sort of move around. But once you get the sail loaded up in a sailboat, they're stable as a table. And but for a lot of new people to sailing, the first time I take them out on the boat, it starts tipping, 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 and their eyes get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they freak out. And here I am, just I prop my foot up, and I'm used to it. And I actually remember the first time I went out in a keel boat. That's what they call these boats with the ballast keels. I'd been in dinghies before that, and they'd do their thing, but I hadn't actually been in a keel boat. And I went out racing. I crewed with a fellow one night, and it was quite windy. And I remember the boat tipped over so far that he was just standing on the side of the seat, like it had a wheel, and he was just standing on like the front side of the seat, because it was almost that's how far we tipped. And he was just so calm, just standing there perfectly upright, and I was freaking out. I was like, this is not good. Like, what's happening? But his calmness is what sort of brought me down to earth. And I realized, wait a minute, this is unnatural, but it's what's supposed to happen. And I think that's kind of what's happening in this passage today. Jesus and the disciples are heading across the Sea of Galilee into Gentile territory. And these were not seafaring people. They had boats and stuff, and yes, they were fishermen, but they weren't fishermen the way we picture it. These were not people that wanted to be crossing the Sea of Galilee. And for ancient Israelite people, the sea represented chaos. So this is a very metaphorical story as well. And so they're crossing the sea, and the winds come up, and Jesus is just sleeping in the back, and the disciples are freaking out, and they finally wake him up and say, "Dude, what's going on? Like, how can you be sleeping? There's chaos." And he calms the storm. And as someone that likes boats and spent a lot of time in boats, I really wonder how much of a miracle story this really is. A miracle in the sort of magical sense. Because I've been through that experience where, and then I've been the calming influence, where it seems like chaos is happening, and then someone that sort of knows what's going on can say, no, 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 hold on. And then it seems like the storm's gone away. Can say, this is how it's supposed to be. And, you think about the disciples, it was a tumultuous time to begin with. They thought they were going to change the world, and they did, not the way they anticipated, way bigger than they anticipated. And they were heading over to Gentile territory. Jews and Gentiles didn't really get along in those days. They didn't really see the benefit in helping each other, and so it was like, everything about this situation was foreign, and there's Jesus asleep. He says it's fine, and that's what brought peace to them, peace to the group. And I think that's a really important message for this weekend. I was sort of thinking about what I wanted to preach on this weekend, whether I'd go with the lectionary or find something else, because there's a lot going on this weekend. It's Father's Day. It's Aboriginal Sunday. Indigenous People Sunday. It's been called Aboriginal Sunday for years, and we just recently changed it to Indigenous Sunday. We should always ask people what they want to be called, so Indigenous people. Also, there's been residential school discoveries with the 250 children found. There's been the shooting, the stuff in London with racial attacks against Muslims. There's been, just ongoing stuff with COVID and politics. There's a lot going on right now this weekend, and I think it kind of almost seems unrelated, but as I've been thinking about it, I think it all kind of, there might be a common thread, and that is sort of our feverish commitment to, or our desire to just latch on to something that we know is true. Let me start with Father's Day, actually. Father's Day is a tricky day. I've got a good relationship with my father, and I know a lot of you do. But not everybody has that. Not everybody has a father. Or, if they did, maybe it wasn't a good relationship. And some relationships with fathers can be really difficult. So it's not a unifying experience on Father's Day. Like, just Father's Day can be a tricky thing for everybody. Some people may think, this is just great, I get to go fishing with my dad. Other people might think, this is pretty terrible because it reminds me of abuse and I don't want to think about Father's Day. It's pretty tricky. It's fraught. And, how we approach Father's Day, do we say, nope, it's about this is what the culture is, family, really important, if we really latch onto that, how does that make other people feel? But if we throw it out altogether, how does that make our fathers feel that need to be celebrated? It's tricky. It's fraught. In terms of residential schools, this was a case of one culture thinking they were superior to another and going out of their way to re-educate and really doing a lot of harm. This was, the word cultural genocide is being used, and it's accurate. The goal was, what's the phrase, to take the Indian out of the boy. And that was us clinging to our culture. And I think one of the great things about Canada today, like 2021 and the last couple of years, I think one of the things I've been really enjoying is just learning about Indigenous culture. Like, there's so much Indigenous music out there and Indigenous stories that are coming out, and this sort of, I'm really enjoying it. And we tried to extinguish that culture. And that's not even touching on the generations of people that were dealing with abuse and the death and lack of generational parenting, passing down parenting practices through generations. Like, we latched on to something we knew. I think the same could be said even for the strife between Islam and just generally the Middle East and Western culture right now. When you immigrate, especially from like a really different culture, that's really hard. And my in-laws are immigrants from Taiwan, and I've talked with them and learned about the experience of coming to a new country and not speaking the language, and the culture and the practices all being different, and having to learn that in another language, and maybe you've left your old culture for a reason, but at the same time, you're not ready to give it up wholly. My in-laws came. They haven't said explicitly, but they've sort of hinted that they came because China was shooting missiles at Taiwan, and they said, you know what, enough's enough. We're going somewhere safer. Does that mean they don't love Taiwanese culture? No, it means they don't want missiles fired at them. But they've come here, and now they've got to do that dance of like, how much Canadian culture do we take on? How much Taiwanese culture do we take on? And then in Canada, we ask this wonderful question, well, how much of Taiwanese culture is Canadian culture, right? And so when we're talking about Islam, this just seems to just trigger people. It seems to be really threatening to people. And I think there is that sense that there are Islamic extremists, and it is a very different culture, and there is some significant violence happening in the Middle East. And when people immigrate, for better or for worse, they're going to bring some of that with them. But at the same time, it's hard. It's really hard. And they've come here because, we're kind of an accepting culture. We're a melding pot. Like Canada, Indigenous people aside, is a country of immigrants, whether you're Scotch, Irish, English, Syrian, Taiwanese, whatever. We are a country that for our entire history has been, or our entire colonial history has been immigration. So our culture is made up of everybody else's culture. But we've also developed our own culture over the last 200 years as well, 300 years, depending what part of the country you're in. And so the question is like, what do you cling on to? And if you're clinging on to something, what threatens you? I was having a conversation actually this morning before work with my cousin, and we talk about Quebec a lot. I think Quebec history is just fascinating, and French-Canadian culture is really interesting. And we were talking about sort of how Quebec's got a reputation for not being the most culturally sensitive culture. But also, it's a distinct culture. They've got 500 years of history in Quebec that, they've got a 300-year head start on the rest of us, except maybe the East Coast, maybe 200, 250. But, like, they have a huge cultural head start on the rest of us. And the ties have been severed with France. Quebec doesn't really have that relationship with France that English Canada has with the UK. And so they are this unique, distinct culture. And in protecting that, it kind of happens to the exclusion sometimes of other cultures. And we were talking about how fraught it really is to try and protect something, and especially something cultural, because for starters, cultural is a judgment call. And secondly, to protect myself usually means at the expense of something else. Protection is not usually I stay in my camp, you stay in yours. Usually at some point you're going to bump up against each other, and someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And there's, if you're protecting yourself, you're really trying to make sure that you win. And how far we go down that road really depends on a lot of things. But when we're talking about protection, usually there's a loser. So coming back to Jesus and the disciples in the boat, I wonder if when we're trying to protect something, it's not like the disciples sort of clinging on to what they know and being afraid of whatever the chaos they're going into, and feeling like they're in this big storm. And I wonder if that's not where we are in a lot of cases. Like when we sort of think of traditional family culture on a day like Father's Day, is our sort of trying to protect our culture and our relationship with our family and the things we know, is clinging on to that, is it possible to hurt other people? with Indigenous people. We did significantly hurt a whole people. To this day, they're recovering from it, and they will for a long time, because we clung to what we knew. We weren't willing to go to that other side of the lake. It's the same happening with Islam and general immigration, but especially Middle Eastern immigration right now. The people that have been here for a few more generations often feel very threatened and by a strange culture and a different culture, and we feel very threatened. And so if we're grabbing on, if we're protecting, are we going to do damage? It's quite fraught. I'm a little worried. I talked about this a few weeks ago. I'm a little worried that the folks that have sort of already settled in Tweed, as sort of immigration happens, or migration rather, people sort of come from the cities in larger and larger numbers, because that has happened and will continue to happen. What are we going to grasp onto? And should we? Should we be sort of just stepping back? I think it's interesting that while I've been talking about this, the winds come up and the storm's coming up. But should we be grasping on to what we know, or just allowing that sort of calm that Jesus embodied, of just, the uncertainty's okay, and just seeing where it's going, trusting that God's doing something? The Old Testament passage today is David and Goliath. And that doesn't really have a whole lot to do with anything, but one of my favorite phrases lately is that God even used the Philistines, Goliath being a Philistine. Can we trust that God's in control even when it doesn't feel that God's in control, and just see what the future holds? And can we do that sort of calmly and gently? And as I'm coming to a close today, the question I want you to ponder, and I think this is a really important question, a two-part question. One is, what does your culture mean to you? And I'm going to let you define that as broadly or finely as you want. You could talk greater Western culture, you could talk Tweed culture, you could talk, I don't know, just whatever's on your mind. What does that culture that is on your mind mean to you? And the second thing is, what are you afraid of losing from it? If you were to let go and sort of just go with the flow more, what is the thing that you're afraid of losing? Amen.